Started. I guess it's 1:30 and people will probably trickle in. That's okay too. My name is Sarah Drasner. I'm here to talk to you about SVG today, and the purpose of this talk is actually just like, oh my god, what? SVG is really capable of a ton of different amazing effects. So we're just going to have a lot of fun this afternoon and go through a slew of things that are kind of mind-blowing that this graphics that is built with math is capable of. So the title of the talk is SVG Can Do That. This is a picture of me. I'm not sure if you can see it, as a child and my mother. It's also my relationship with authority. I am a senior developer advocate at Microsoft. I just started this week, so I'm really excited about that job. That's really cool. I also work for CSS Tricks as a staff writer there, along with Mia, who's somewhere in this audience. There she is, yes. Cool. SVG. What can it do? I'm here to talk to you today about SVG. SVG is capable of so many crazy things and is such a flexible medium for the web. I could literally talk about this all day. This talk was actually 2 hours long when I first started writing it. I had to cut it down a bit. I tried my best to hone it down to things to consider for like a greatest hits compilation. It's worth saying at this point that I'm going to be showcasing some of these techniques in a lot of demos. All of the demos are built by me unless I specifically say otherwise, and I'll give you links to the code pen that they made and also their Twitter account so that you can go follow them. I'll also tweet out the slides at the end if you want to go look at all the slides. Everything is open source. So if I kind of gloss over one thing that you're really interested in, have no fear, you can dig into all the code later. Here we go. Hopefully a lot of you are here because you're already aware of some of the benefits of SVG, but just in case you don't, or you're aware that it might be good, but I don't really know why, SVG is crisp on any display. Like I said before, it's built with math. That means that you don't have to do any kind of image replacement for Retina or anything. It's all going to be perfectly crisp, even now on mobile, even on Retina, on any device. It's less HTTP requests to handle. It's actually no HTTP requests to handle because you can write it directly inline, and that's what we're going to be doing a lot today because that's the widest support for animation and interaction and some of these crazy effects that we're going to be doing. This will become less of a big deal when we start moving over to HTTP2, but in the meantime, this is a really, really good thing. It's easily scalable for responsive. This is one of the big ones, and that's something that we're going to dive into very heavily today. And it's a very small file size if you design for performance. If you design for performance is also a key tenet of this, so we'll go into what that means. It's easy to animate. It has a navigable DOM, which means that everything that you put inside of an SVG are things that you can just dive right into, slap a class on, and start moving around just like you did with HTML. That's really, really powerful. That's the same workflow we're used to as developers. If you try that with bitmaps, you have to cut out someone's arm and absolutely position it, and then you got to deal with responsive, and it's a little bit of a nightmare. SVG, you don't have to worry about any of those things. It's easy to make accessible. It's easy to make accessible because it has a navigable DOM. And I'm going to actually teach you how you can make them accessible, and you can just rip the code right out of that slide and reuse it and make everything good for screen readers. It's also fun. Remember fun? Fun was good. Fun building things. So yeah, SVG is a bit of a party. You know, you can either like make a party yourself, or you can have JavaScript be the event coordinator for you. Get it? Event. Yeah, there's more bad dad jokes coming up. If you don't like that one, you should. I actually hope that this is the last year that I have to show this slide. I work as a consultant, or did before I started out with Microsoft this year, and the thing that I often had to remind people of, or like the thing that people often had in their heads, was that SVG was poorly supported, and it's not at all. It used to be poorly supported many years ago, but you really have to update that. Look at all of that green. And I don't know why Can I Use only shows you back to IE 11. It's really back to IE 9. So it's really far back, and you can use it for all sorts of things. And you should be checking your analytics to see if you need fallbacks even at all. So what does the scalable mean when I refer to scalable vector graphics? You can see here when we place the graphic directly inline in the HTML, it has width and height attributes, which keep it to that size. But if I take those out, you can see the graphic take up the whole screen. And then in CSS, I can make it constrained to the viewport width and height. I can also make it fill up CSS grid or flexbox. Anything goes here. The graphic and its innards will all stay totally stable. So if you don't like positioning things in CSS, SVG is pretty incredible because you can see how stable that graphic is, even though there are multiple elements inside of it that you can now access. Is positioning in CSS getting you down? SVG might be your answer, especially for something that's really, really complex. As a side note, I did this to myself recently on a plane. I was watching a horror movie and like splashed the whole wine glass in my face. Anyway. SVG lets you create advanced type lockups that look slick and professional while still using actual accessible text. Check out how stable that is for responsive development. You don't even have to alter it or anything. Which means that in terms of animation, we can create something that's fully responsive in every direction because we're working within the SVG coordinate system. I know it's hard to kind of see on that display, but the slides are available to you later as well to see. We don't even have to adjust our animation with any new values either. So if I replay this, and then I randomly resize it, you can see the animation keeps playing, and I don't have to do any kind of weird things with media queries or anything. All of the animation is working within the coordinate system and will stay totally stable. So animation values scale too. So these type of positioning refinements that are trivial if you're going to hide and display things like icons and do all sorts of advanced techniques for menus to conserve space on smaller viewports. I made this pen with a tool by Sarah Swedon that helps you arrange icons in a circular format. I'll tweet you the link to the side slider, which also has all these resources. That's the link to the Circulus tool. It doesn't necessarily have to be fully fluid either. Let's implement some responsive design. So let's say we're building ourselves a Huggy Laser Panda factory, like you have in normal life. If we were doing such a thing, we might make some different pieces of interaction, which we could put together with different sections that combined, so that on mobile it's stacked. In the middle piece is reflected, it's actually translated backwards so that it can lock into place. And you can see that these are just 3 different SVGs that are kind of locking together like Lego blocks. Then, when we create our Huggy Laser Panda factory, we can also have some movement that makes it feel alive, and then if you have a panda being painted, a panda that's lasered, and a panda that's huggy, and it all scales down to mobile and works wonderfully. I've even tested this on old Windows and it still works. Even all of the interaction. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but GreenSock is the animation library that I've used for this. It's a really great animation API that myself and a lot of other SVG animators use pretty frequently because it's known to fix any kind of cross-browser issues. It has a lot of other traits, but that's a really, really big one. In this piece of code, we're creating a timeline animation that will create the repetitive movement that you saw with the bubbles and the gears and everything. And that repeat -1 at the bottom there, I'm going to get stuck on the microphone. The repeat -1 that you see there is what causes the whole thing to loop. Passing that option is how you do that in GreenSock. Then for each section, I have a different timeline, pause the animation initially, and then I trigger it on a click event And note that, it's just a circle within the SVG DOM. That accepts click events as well. The animation is scoped to each SVG block, so everything stays really organized. If I need to update something, I know exactly where to go from the design right down to the code. Everything is scoped right to those sections. So that's really exciting. We can also use this stability for page transitions, which I think is super, super fun. React is really awesome because it helps us manage state in a responsible manner. This is made with React and GreenSock. React coordinates the state, while GreenSock choreographs all of the intermediary values. Oh. And you could keep looping around and going over those animations again and again. When we're showing the transition from one page to another in our single page app, we can use SVG to stabilize some of the graphics and do really interesting effects. So in this example, in the state itself, I'm using this idea of screens. When I click on the button, we can advance the screen, looping back around first, to the first, and for each new screen, we fire a function that handles our animation separately. Then we hang a timeline off that function that we can choreograph and finely tune the way that the movement works. This event was simply our hook. So the other cool thing about GreenSock is it allows us methods to clear some of the properties that we've set in line on the elements already during the course of that animation. So that clear props right there is what allows us to kind of reset everything when it's through. Here's another one I made with Nuxt. This is Nuxt and Vue.js. I really have been getting into Vue.js lately. It's another technology that's kind of similar to React, has some key similarities, key differences. Nuxt is something that you can use with Vue. It's a CLI tool that that allows you to quickly spin up server-side rendering and routing without ever stepping out of a Vue file. So that's really cool. And it gives you these hooks for page transitions right out of the gate. So you could be using CSS animations for these, or GreenSock animations, and you can see because it's SVG, it stayed totally stable when we were kind of making it smaller for responsive. So if you'd like to check out the code for this, there's a repo to explore here, and there's a live demo site for it as well. I'm showing you this slide so that you can get a taste for how SVG animation in a page route is done. The page hooks for CSS are as simple as adding a class, but here we're using JavaScript because we're doing some more complicated things. You might have noticed that all the mountains and all the letters had a different entrance and exit per page. They also waited for one page's animation to end before having the next one come in. That is this out-in mode right here. That allows Vue to know, okay, wait until the one animation's done and then kick off the other one. Usually we'd have to write some sort of callback to make that happen, or we'd have to do imposed delays, and we don't have to do that. This demo from Code Drops has a similar concept, but in a different way. The fixed content lies beneath the intro content, and then once we move the intro content one up, it gets revealed. So at the same time, an SVG path is morphed in, defined by path data ID. This pen uses anime.js, so we have to make sure all of those SVG paths are the same. This pen by Sullivan Nolan combines two effects, transitioning the sections while morphing the lines from one drawing to another. This is done with Morph SVG and GreenSock, and the effect is pretty captivating. Again, note the stability of the graphic and animation as I size the browser down. So that will happen in a second. We can also use SVG for the layout itself. While we were building the Web Animations workshop page, we decided that we wanted the layout divided into these sections that complemented our branding, which is these triangles. And by designating preserve aspect ratio none on these SVGs, it allows the SVG to fully take the shape of the container. Usually with a graphic, you don't want to do that because it makes your face kind of squishy and all kinds of things. But if you're doing something like SVG for layout, that's awesome for responsive layout. You can see that I actually just, I actually just want that triangle to collapse as we get down on mobile. So it's perfect for responsive layout. All right, we covered a bunch of kind of layouty things. Now let's talk about how SVG can be super tiny and great for performance. This graphic is from the HTTP archive. It shows a breakdown of what kind of data is transferred across the internet. It reveals what we spend our performance budgets on. So you can see how big that section for images is. That's that big blue one for the people in the back. It's more than half. It's like almost 2/3 of everything. And I love this quote. You can't be a web performance expert without being an image expert. If you think about that last graphic, it's actually true. If you want to make the biggest dent in your performance metrics, it's worth thinking about the cost of your graphics. And not all SVGs are created equal. You can make really small SVGs. You can also make really bloated SVGs. So how do we make them super tiny? Here are some tools that I really enjoy. SVG OMG is by far my favorite. It uses SVGO, that terminal tool that's the third in the line, but it has a web-based GUI that you can, has tons of toggles and you can kind of see what you're doing, which is really important for SVGs. It's built by Jake Archibald, if you're familiar with his work on the Google Chrome team. It also uses service workers, so whatever toggles you use and whatever settings that you set, it will remember that the next time you go there, so it's pretty nice. That second one, Peter Collinridge's SVG editor, is just like, I love it because it just keeps on trucking. It's been around for like 10 years. It's an old Rails app. It's just like, but there's like an experimental tab that's been experimental for 8 years as well that I really like. You should check out. You can kind of edit the SVG while you're in there. It's pretty cool. The SVGO, like I said, is a terminal-based tool. If you're more comfortable in your terminal, definitely go for that. But I would pair it with SVGO GUI because it really does depend, like how you're optimizing your SVG really changes the way that the SVG looks. So you actually need to see what you're doing a bit. So those are a good pairing. I also wrote a whole post about some tips and tricks that you can use to create high-performance SVGs. I worked on a project where I took the site performance from 10 seconds load time to 2 seconds load time just by optimizing the SVGs. So that post is just like all of the stuff I did for that project. So in this pen, I've drawn a little spaceman standing on the moon and the cow goes over it, kind of surprising him each time. I've used Draggable for this and it's touch device enabled for mobile, and the whole SVG is 2 kilobytes. That's pretty nice. If you're actually kind of thinking, if you have performance in mind, SVG graphics can be really engaging and performant and stable and super tiny. While we're looking at this, let's take a gander at what's happening under the hood and a gotcha I ran into while I was building it. The way I worked with it first was to create this null object. You can see that there's like this rectangle, and I thought maybe I could spin it around that rectangle and then detect collisions between the rectangle and his helmet. But it started firing all the time, and I couldn't understand why that was going on. And the reason why is because the DOM doesn't see diagonals like that. They actually see these rectangles. So even as you're I made this pen to kind of show what's going on here, but look at this circle. That's so weird. If you're ever doing things with like bounding client rect or like trying to, or get VBox, geez, I keep hitting this. Just keep that in mind, that's what the DOM is actually seeing. Okay, back to the weight of SVGs. Because they have the potential to be so small, SVG is a perfect time to use a loader for animation. GIF loaders are actually really big, and some of them are really ugly. When a designer gave me this graphic, it was 35 kilobytes. This is for Smashing Magazine's checkout experience. It was 35 kilobytes, and they're like, we're thinking about throwing this idea out. I optimized it and brought it down to 6 kilobytes, including all of the animation that it takes to run the thing. So if you think you have to sacrifice performance in order to work with SVG, you don't have to, not if you're working with them appropriately and optimizing them correctly. And that's a pretty complex graphic. That's not like, a couple of dots or something. SVGs can make other graphics smaller. If you check out this amazing thing that Shaw built, you should definitely follow him. Is this not running? Okay, well, you should check out this tool later. This is basically, you can drag an image in that's a JPEG or a PNG, and it makes it a ton smaller. By taking an image and applying a mask to areas that bitmaps are just repetitively telling you what's in each square. And we can get a pretty huge savings here. This demo that's broken that I'll fix by the time you look at the slides changed our graphic from 38 kilobytes to 16 kilobytes, even though it's a JPEG, even though it's a PNG. And that's just one sampling. I didn't try like a whole bunch of graphics to find the best one. I just dragged a random graphic in there. So potential for bigger savings is probably huge. So that's a really cool tool, and you should definitely check it out. So we can also make a responsive image sprite. Like, so let's say that we're going to, I don't know if you know what Book of Kells is. They have these initial illustrations where the A is really big and then it has a bunch of designs around it. So if we wanted to do a modern day Book of Kells, but have that graphic change based on desktop or tablet or mobile, like let's say that's the desktop, that's the tablet, that's the mobile. I could take that design and kind of dry out the design too, right? I could say, what's repeated in each section, what can I slap a class on and reveal and hide with a media query? That works the same way as it does with any HTML element in regular HTML, CSS land. And I can make a sprite like this, where I have a slightly more complicated graphic on the top, and I can change things out with a media query. So I can have this graphic that's on the side of this text that is animated, and you can see it's changing, and it's different based on the display. On tablet, you have this kind of green background, and on mobile, you have like a really, really condensed view. The way that that's actually a sprite, so the way that we changed that, SVGs have this thing called a view box in which you peer in them. So you can actually just change the view box with a media query shift and change it from one view of it to another one. That whole animation and SVG was 8 kilobytes gzipped. Compare that to using text and photos to show off an article. You might actually make a giant savings by going over to SVG. So I mentioned this before, SVG can be accessible because it has a navigable DOM. Let's dig into how you do it. We can have title and ARIA, associative ARIA tags that give screen readers some idea of what's going on visually. The big gotcha here is that we need an ID of title on the title in order for the screen reader to pick it up. I don't know why that is. There's like a bug in JAWS or something like that, but they need that ID of title. It's also good to put whatever language it is, so that if they're reading in another language, like let's say they're trying to read in Spanish, they're actually leveraging the browser and the screen reader to do that for them. The other thing I'll point out is that I have a role of presentation on here. That allows the screen reader to skip announcing everything that's in that graphic. I mentioned there's a navigable DOM and there's all this stuff in there. It just reinforces like, hey, don't go through and say like circle, path, rect, like that kind of thing. There are a bunch of more resources below. Heather's article here is a really wonderful resource. She went to the library every Sunday for a while and just checked everything out on different devices and all these different graphics. That wasn't for a lot of money or anything, that was for the community, so definitely use that tool. SVG can be styled like text. Someone reached out to me on Twitter. This happens fairly frequently, that people don't have an SVG sprite system and they're trying to use it inline, an SVG icon instead of a font icon, and they don't know how to get it to style along with the text. So here's the original question code. There's a bunch of things here. I just left it exactly the way that they sent it to me. And the secret trick here that you might not know about is that the fill needs to be current color. And as soon as you make the fill current color, then it will just match whatever text styles are around it. So and there's all sorts of other little things that I did here to improve. And I wrote a lot of comments, so if you want to check that out later, you can. SVG can bounce. This is something that I really like. We can make a ball bounce with SVG without any animation libraries by just using a request animation frame. Here we have a ball bouncing, and we can use a little physics to make the ball bounce, but also subsequently update on the way up, or change its gravity when it gets bigger, or change its radius. We're using Vue.js to manipulate the animation midstream. So there's a lot more info that I'm not showing here, but basically we have an initial total height and the radius that we store in the data. Then we have the methods that will be called to increase the height or the radius when we click the button. And then we have the initialization of the animation that has some gravity to update and some vertical, speed, acceleration and all of those things. We're also going to change the button based on whether or not the animation is running. Look how legible that is. We're just changing it, if running, and then it gives a different condition. And then we have request animation frame to bounce that ball using that previous bounce ball method. This pen by Tiffany Rayside is one of my favorite animations of all time. She's not using a library at all. She's spinning up pieces of the SVG and applying all of the physics necessary. Oh, I keep doing this. So you can see if I throw this around, it's bouncing. This is just flat out SVG and vanilla JavaScript. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's unreal. She's a master. You should definitely go follow her on CodePen. She makes some really amazing things. SVG can snap. I mentioned how you can manipulate path values in the last example, and that kind of manipulation is supercharged when we start combining them with ES6 template literals. So previously, if you're not familiar with template literals, previously we'd have to do these string concatenations where we'd have quotes, and then we'd add things together, and it was kind of a mess and hard to read. And if we wanted to say that same sentence, hi, I ordered 5 apples and 2 oranges, we could write it in with these backticks and these kind of little curly braces that allow JavaScript to know we're going to pass in a variable or something. So this is a cool pen by Anthony Dubois that allows you to explore how paths are built and how their values get updated to build these lines. I also have a book that breaks all of these down if you need to, but you can see how you can start to see how in this GUI, like if you add a point, there's a bunch of different things available to you. You can see all the path values at the bottom update. So if you're not familiar with SVG path values and you're learning, sometimes it's not just like reading through it. You gotta kind of play around with it. That's a really great tool. So if we know enough about how those curves are made, all we have to do to update them for an animation is a template literal and some math. So when building out these reflected path curves, we can start with an M, which stands for move to, followed by 2 values after the point in the coordinate system. I like Qs. Qs are cool. They're one of my favorite path curve values. So that one of those 2 values of points are for the Bezier handle, which is that gray dot that you see. And then the last 2 points are where it ends up. Pretty cool that you can say 2 path values, 2 values, 2 values, 2 values, and the computer can draw a curve. I can never get over that. That's so neat. So we can use that concept and some just regular old JavaScript to plot the points, initially going through them with an L, which is a line, and then eventually update it to a Q, which makes those curves. And the points in between get really flexible. So then we can make things like this to celebrate the yarn release, and you can see it bouncing and snapping. SVG can distort. You might have noticed in that last demo that SVG was distorting and waving around. Let's dig into how we do that really briefly. SVG has a thing called filters. There are contrast filters, blur filters, distortion filters, you name it, you got it. You can create some really advanced effects in SVG with some of those. There was a post on CodeDrops where they had a lot of buttons, and certainly the most impressive one was when they used this thing called a turbulence filter. So if you do use a filter in your code, I want to point out a gotcha to you. A lot of times when I use a filter to animate, I'll use these helper functions, which allow me to apply the filter when I need it and take it off when it's done. And what that allows me to do is use those filters in the animation and not hit any performance costs when it's not running, because animating filters are pretty performance heavy, like they're kind of CPU heavy, so being kind of sensitive to that is really nice. They're not actually animatable properties. We're kind of hacking the system to get these to work. So this is kind of like creative coding area. So we can make something like this, which is a ripple in a pool, and it will just kind of cascade out and kind of look like a ripple. And the way it's done is by applying a filter along with this image that looks like a ripple. And then we can animate the filter, moving it backwards and forwards, and then scaling it once it hit that wall. I didn't intend to have this pen be like on this day. It's kind of ill-timed. We can make things like a globe exploding. It's really awkward. Okay, let's move to the next one. By animating filters, we can also do really advanced effects by like making this realistic candle. This is made out of math. We did this by applying both a filter and a contrast at once. I didn't invent that technique. That's called the GUI effect that was built by Lucas Beber, and I'll show you his prior art in a second. But you can do all sorts of things with vectors. They don't only have to look like straight lines. They can actually look really elemental. So the way that I built that was to draw all of these shapes that looked like a candle in Illustrator and apply a gradient here. And then they're not actually blue or anything. I just cut these the path shapes into different things so you could see how many of them there are. Basically, I'm looping through and alternating that path value. I'm just taking those path points and changing them, morphing them one into another while applying these filters. And the pen was started off here. This was what started everybody off on this goo craze. It's beautifully done, which we've come to expect of Lucas Beber's work, who has a whole slew of interesting things. So he applied the blur and contrast filters at the same time, and I guess they're like enemies in the wild. So they make this kind of cool, like they fight and make this kind of cool goo effect. You can apply them to HTML elements as well. These are HTML elements. These aren't even SVGs. So the way that I did that candle pen, I just mentioned that it was I looped through all of those. So the first thing I did was animate the standard deviation of the filter. Like I said, it's not an animatable property, but since I'm using GreenSock for this, which is request animation frame under the hood, it's beautifully done. It can just grab two numeric values and animate them. So I'm just grabbing those values and changing them. And as far as those little point values go, I'm using a plugin called Morph SVG and looping through all of those things that I've named F1, F2, F3, F4, so that they can, go loop through and use each one of them. I can also make smoke, which you can't see because it's too dark. SVG can also do on-the-fly logo adjustment. This demo was made by Leah Veru, and if you don't know her already, you're really missing out. Check out how flexible updating this logo is. No more going back and forth with your designer and adding or removing logo files if you need adjustments. By the way, you can even leverage her tool that she's using here. She's demoing a tool called Mavo to make demos like this work. Basically, she made this whole system so that people can build websites without CSS or JavaScript. So I don't know if you ever have like family members who want you to make a website for them. They're like, just come on, my dog needs a website, and you're like, I'm a little busy. And they're like, well, it's exposure. So you can check out her site and maybe even show them the site so that they can use it. It's a really good tool for the key experiencer skills. SVGs can increase KPIs, actually. So a long time ago we used to have these infographics, and people were sharing infographics all the time. So we had, you can't see this, but it basically says that every time you use an infographics, all of the metrics went up by a lot. It was like 243 actions versus 1,000 actions. There's tons more actions, like retweets and shares and all sorts of stuff. And they had all sorts of conversion from it. Here's one source, and there's plenty of links in here. It increased website traffic by over 400%, lead increased by 4,500%, the number of new visitors to their site by 78%, but all of those posts are over 2 years old, so what happened? Some of the problems here are that it's not responsive. There was a tipping point in mobile where people stopped sharing and looking at Twitter so much on their desktop. And infographics, I don't know if you've ever seen one on your phone, but they're horrible pinch and grab affairs, and you can't really see any of them. So I think that probably had something to do with it. It's not updated to the current context. That used to be like really salon-style design, and we don't really design like that now. It's kind of like flatter and more sleek and things like that. So I built this pen which again, you can't really see very well, but it's basically like a whole bunch of icons surrounding, and it's different ways to combat global warming, and there's like a bunch of text that comes up for each one. So it's animated, the user can kind of guide themselves through the interaction. It's also accessible, and it's also responsive for mobile. So all of those things, again, stay totally stable. But in this case, we're not just taking one graphic and making it squishy, and we're not taking multiple graphics and pushing them around each other. We're actually changing the viewbox in JavaScript like we did before, but truncating one piece of it and showing different content for the top. So we're actually taking it, it's a larger view, and then we're like on the fly cropping it with that viewbox. And then we can just alter it with some responsive and media queries. You already know how to work with media queries. Good news, it still applies. That's great. SVG can draw itself. That's a pretty cool thing that you can have an SVG, like a drawing that looks like it's drawing itself onto your page. So let's dig into how that's done. Say you have a shape, and the shape has a stroke that's dashed. But then you make the dash really, really, really long, so it goes over the entire thing, and there's still that offset. Oh God, I keep doing that. I'm Italian, I'm sorry. That's really, really long, and that dash offset is like the size of that whole shape. Well, that's an animatable property. So you can just take the whole offset, have it start off there, and push it back onto the page. So you can do things like this, New Year's pen that has all these like crazy, things drawing on. And then this pen by Chris Gannon is way cool. He's basically using that like ability to draw combined with a clip path to make really, really interesting and innovative effects. You should definitely go check out his work and follow him as well. You can interact with an SVG. So I built this. This is like, a sleeping woman, but every time I hit a key, different things happen. So, a bunch of different, I'm actually combining a bunch of the techniques we already went over today in order to create that pen. One of my friends says it's like his nightmares. I'm just going to cover one of those small techniques in order to kind of go over that. But basically, because a circle is built with a radius and 2 values, what I can do is once I hit that key, I'm updating the radius, and I'm not going to hit that again. Make it a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to also update the coordinate where it's plotted at and make that a little bit smaller every time I make that, so that balloon looks like it's increasing in size. Then, once it gets to that radius gets to a certain size, I have a timeline that I fire that has a lot of animations in it, like a bunch of balloon pieces, like kind of spreading out everywhere, and then at the end of a set timeout, it collapses back to where it was. We can manipulate and interact with SVG on the fly as well. Since SVG has a navigable DOM, we can spin up pieces of it on the fly, change its visual output, and of course play and pause animation as we or the user wishes. Since SVG is flexible, it can be really interactive. We can make it turn into an animation as well, but it's still a graphics format. So as we're kind of playing around with this, we can decide that we're going to play, and then we're going to download the image, and we can download the image at any point in time too. And if we open that in a new window, then you can see it's respecting all of those areas that we're moving around during the animation as well. So here inside the HTML template, we can create some semantic form elements. The button click will bind to a method that we define in the view instance, and in the create big circles event, we get this reference of the SVG in the correct namespace, spin up some circles, and use helper functions for random sizes to create different types of values. I use dorky names like totes rando for these. You don't have to use those names. To create the animation, we do something really similar. Here we have some form elements with buttons that play and pause the animation. Then we begin an animation timeline or pause it depending on the interaction. So we can also make Wally, he's one of my favorite characters. He has a cockroach friend, so I made the mouse his cockroach friend instead. So basically he looks around all the time and is constantly bopping his head around. But the way that I made the interaction was to create an entire timeline where he's reaching his arms out and then pause it and map that and plot it, that progress of the timeline along with the coordinates that we're capturing in that event. And this is, I'm doing in Vue. You could do it with any technology though. There's a ton of code that I'm not showing you here. That's not all the code that it takes to run that. We're running low on time. I'm gonna start getting, talking like the micro machine guy and speaking really quickly. Maybe a lot of you are young and don't know that reference. I'll be speaking quickly. SVG can be clipped and masked. With that Wally guy, you kind of saw how his arms were reaching out. It's really vital for things like SVG animation to hide and show things. And I couldn't just tuck his arms behind things. They actually need to poke out. So SVG clip path actually has better support than SVG itself. It goes back to Chrome 1 and Firefox 1.5 or something. It goes way, way back. And you can use them on HTML elements as well. Clipping will cut off an element based on its shape, but masks will reveal opacity based on another shape. So here we've created some masking with a GIF to reveal an SVG pattern. So we have this pattern in the SVG that we've made by hand or whatever, and then we're just revealing some of it with this GIF masking. We create a mask in defs, and within it place the image that we want to use. Then on the rectangle on the page, we apply the pattern we created as well as the mask, and the mask will only see bits of that pattern. And I didn't invent that technique or anything. This kind of idea or way of working with things is by Yoxel, who's a brilliant front-end developer. She has a whole slew of pens like this, and they're all really, really cool. You should go check her work out as well. She also made this really, really great reference pen, which is the most comprehensive learning tool I've ever found to talk about clipping and masking, both in SVG and in CSS. So that's a really good link to look at. I also wrote a CSS tricks article about the difference between clipping and masking because I was doing client work and I was like, wait, I don't think I know what the difference is. I was trying to use one for the other, so I just wrote an article about it so that I would understand it better. Since SVG has text, we can even apply those crazy GIF masks to text, and the text can be editable. That's pretty fun. And this pen by Noel Delgado is probably the most famous and also my favorite. You can see how parts of the body are sort of revealed when paired with interaction. I just think that that's super cool. SVG can signify something changing. I made this dial to see different time zones and where I was in India and I couldn't figure out what time it was in Denver, and so I had to keep on looking it up, and so I made this dial so I could keep seeing what the different time zones were. And that SVG graphic in the background, well, the whole dial is SVG, but that graphic in the background is kind of signifying the time of day so that you can kind of get a sense of whether it's day or night. Side note, in order to make this, I was using moment.js to parse all of the different time changes and respect daylight savings. But there's actually a native thing called toLocalTime and you can remove that library and use this if you I actually have a JSON file that I can link to that I didn't link to here that has all of the different time codes and time zones, and you can remove I think it's 40 megabytes or something from your code. You can use an SVG's viewbox as a camera. This is a really cool thing. I don't know if you know what a viewbox is, but it's literally the window that peers into the graphics. So SVGs can be really big and expansive, and that viewbox is just telling you what you're seeing inside of the SVG. It passes in 4 values, and that's just literally the 0, 0, which is the top and the left, and then a width and a height. It's pretty simple. It's actually something that you're probably used to from get bounding client rect and stuff. So if I want to change that view box, if I have something these little houses that I drew, I could say, okay, it's actually 160 in and 215 down, and now the width is 42.2 and something else. So I can update that on the fly. I could calculate that out by hand, but why not make the browser do it for me? And I can do that with a thing called getVbox, which returns an object called SVG rect that has x, y, width, and height, and I can plug those values in and update these coordinates on the fly. So if I wanted to look at these houses that you can't see because it's too dark, if you deleted all of this code here, it would expand back to that graphic, but I'm zeroing in on it really quickly by doing that. So I can do things like have this animated infographic of the world with a bunch of bloopy bits. That's the technical term, bloopy bits. And as you click on them, they're zooming into those path values. And again, SVG, totally stable for responsive, and then it works on mobile. We also have this flowchart where you can ask people different questions, and it goes to different areas in the flowchart based on what they reply. So we're moving the view box based on what they need. And if you want more information about SVG, there's a link in there too. This pen by Andrei Sorkin does the same technique, same kind of thing, but it's draggable. So he's moving it as the user interacts with it. Super neat. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do, SVG can make a game. This is a thing that I made in React called Taco Elephant Hunt. Basically, this elephant wants to go get tacos. He's a hipster elephant. And he's trying to avoid his friends' text messages because they keep changing plans. So you've got to that's extra points for the margarita. Those are bonuses. And usually I die before this. So if I keep playing this game, basically what will happen is, basically if I play this game, you either win and you get a high score that you can tweet out, or if you lose, you become hangry and you have to go to a movie you already saw. So SVG, you already actually, if you're building websites, know a lot of the things that it takes to manage the state for a video game. And SVG can handle all of the graphics for it, especially because they can work so well on mobile. So how do we use SVG in this? 3 ways. Directly inline in the HTML for loops. Background images like tacos, so that we could just throw them. We're not actually interacting with them really. We're just throwing them around, so it's fine for them to be background images. And then we have a couple that are inline in React, and I'll go over that really, really quick. There's a lot of code here that we're not going to go over really, but I made this pen last year when it was totally cool to do React.create class, and it's not anymore, so don't get on my case about it. The score was 500, it started off with 500. We have a few things that check the state of whether the game is playing or not, and whether things are updating or not, and then we're going to pass it down to that heart meter that you saw at the top, which it was an SVG. And the SVG has a rect, which is just this width that has this .props.score. So that will update along with the score. That's what's really nice about SVG. It's just math, so we can update it on the fly if we want. So if we have something like this, I can change the width to 350, and then the rect gets bigger. So you can see how it's easy to make updates on the fly. We're also using request animation frame to check if things are hitting each other by using get bounding client rect and seeing if they intersect. I won't go through all of this one by one. All this, and we didn't even get to database. I have an O'Reilly book. This is not my O'Reilly book. This was my friend trolling me. I don't have a man blob animal. That's not my last name. This is my O'Reilly book. It's called SVG Animations because it's about SVG animations. I also teach web animation workshops with Valhead. We're giving a 1-day workshop in Denver next week. And the tickets are still on sale for a couple of days. If you want to come by, cool. If not, no worries. Thank you.